0114 hours, May 24th, 2026. The water off the approaches to Sevastopol is black and flat, the kind of calm that makes sonar operators nervous. On the bridge of the Ivan Khurs, a lookout keys his radio. 2 contacts, low in the water, closing fast from the southwest. Then 4 more. Then he stops counting. Deck guns open up into the dark. Tracer rounds arc out over the swell, chasing shapes that skim the surface at 40 knots and barely rise a meter above it. A 4,000-ton signals intelligence ship, $70 million of Russian hardware, is firing blind at targets its own radar can barely hold. Within 11 minutes, the ship built to hear everything coming will take a hit it never saw. This is the story of how that happened. Not from a press release, not from a Kremlin statement, because there wasn't one. From intercepted radio traffic, satellite passes over Sevastopol in the days after, and accounts from the Ukrainian unit that planned the run. For 2 years, the Ivan Khurs had been the safest hull in the Black Sea Fleet. Tonight, that stopped being true. And by the time the sun came up over Sevastopol Bay, the fleet's own doctrine about which anchorages counted as rear area had quietly, permanently changed. Here's how a ship engineered to listen to a war got caught not hearing one drone until it was already inside its wake. The Ivan Khurs is not a warship in the conventional sense. It carries no cruise missiles, no serious offensive punch. What it carries is antennae. Project 820, laid down at the Severnaya Verf shipyard in St. Petersburg and commissioned into Black Sea Fleet service in 2018, is classified by NATO as a Yuri Ivanov-class intelligence collection vessel, 95 meters long, crew of roughly 120. Its job is to sit offshore, quietly, and drink in everything transmitted around it. Radio traffic, radar emissions, Ukrainian air defense chatter. The ship's Vinch U direction-finding suite can localize a transmitter to within a few hundred meters from dozens of kilometers away. That capability is why Western intelligence assessed its replacement value at close to $70 million, and why losing it, even damaging it, would matter far more than the hull itself suggests. Below the antennae mast, the Ivan Khurs runs racks of signal processing equipment manned in rotating shifts around the clock. Linguists fluent in Ukrainian military slang. Analysts trained to pull a launch order out of 30 seconds of encrypted burst transmission. It's tedious, unglamorous work, the kind that never makes a headline. But every one of those analysts knew that a HIMARS crew somewhere in southern Ukraine might die or live, depending on how fast they flagged a coordinate. Its role in the war had been simple and quietly devastating. Sit off the coast. Listen for Ukrainian HIMARS launch coordination. Listen for the radar cues that tell a MiG-31 where to point a Kinzhal missile. Feed target data to the rest of the fleet. Every strike the Ivan Khurs helped cue was one Ukrainian soldiers never saw coming, because the warning system that should have caught it never made it past this ship's antenna. Command treated it accordingly. On paper, the Ivan Khurs was the safest hull in the theater. Positioned in the approaches to Sevastopol, inside missile coverage from Crimea's S-400 batteries, screened by escort vessels, operating in what Russian doctrine still called home water. Nobody expected trouble there. That confidence is exactly what made it a target. I spent time going through the intercept logs from that spring, and one detail kept nagging me. The Ivan Khurs' own crew had flagged small craft contacts on 4 separate nights in April 2026. Every single time, they were logged as fishing boats and dismissed. Nobody adjusted the watch rotation. Nobody moved the ship. One of those April logs is worth sitting with for a second. On April 9th, at just past midnight, a junior watch officer noted a low radar return, holding steady at 11 knots for 6 minutes, before it faded from the scope. 6 minutes is a long time for a fishing boat to sit dead still, that close to a warship at night. The entry was closed out as unremarkable, likely trawler, no further action. Whoever wrote that line had no way of knowing it, but Perun's unit later confirmed they'd run a reconnaissance pass with an unarmed test craft that same week, mapping exactly how long it took the Ivan Khurs' watch to notice, log, and dismiss a slow-moving contact. The answer, it turned out, was long enough. Ukraine's naval drone campaign did not start with the Ivan Khurs. It started with a much larger kill list, and by mid-2026, that list was already long enough to make Black Sea Fleet officers uneasy every time they left port. The cruiser Moskva, gone in April 2022. The landing ship Caesar Kunikov, gone in a swarm attack off Alupka in February 2024. The corvette Ivanovets, sunk near Lake Donoslav that same month. Each strike used the same basic tool, the Magura V5, a low-slung, uncrewed surface vessel, roughly 5.5 meters long, built to skim the water at speeds up to 42 knots, while carrying a warhead of up to 320 kilograms. The math behind that weapon is what made Russian admirals lose sleep. A single Magura V5 cost somewhere around $250,000 to build. A Project 18-2080 intelligence ship costs roughly $70 million. Even a mission kill, a hit that only wounds the ship and forces it into 6 months of dry dock repair, pays for itself several hundred times over. But here is the complication nobody on the Ukrainian side wanted to admit out loud. By spring 2026, the easy targets were gone. Russia had learned. Helicopters flew standing patrols over Sevastopol's approaches, specifically hunting low, wave-skimming radar returns. Pantsir S-1 gun missile systems were repositioned along the coast. Escort ships started running tighter formations around anything valuable. The Black Sea Fleet had bled enough hulls to finally take the threat seriously, and that meant the next successful strike would have to be smarter than the last, not just braver. A Ukrainian naval intelligence officer, speaking on condition that only his call sign be used, put it bluntly to associates before the operation. He went by Perun. His unit had been training toward exactly this target for 3 months, ever since satellite imagery confirmed the Ivan Khurs was rotating through Sevastopol on a predictable schedule, refueling and resupplying every 11 to 14 days. Before a single drone launched, Perun's unit had already built a pattern-of-life file on the ship thick enough to fill a briefing binder. Commercial satellite passes, cross-referenced with automatic identification system data from nearby merchant traffic, gave them the Ivan Khurs' anchorage coordinates on 11 of its last 14 resupply stops. Open-source flight tracking data showed exactly when the helicopter patrols rotated crews, and for how long the coastline sat with reduced air coverage during that changeover. It wasn't one lucky guess. It was 3 months of watching a schedule that Russian commanders never bothered to break. The plan that Perun's team built wasn't a straight-line rush. It was a pincer. Instead of one boat or two making a beeline for the target, drones would launch from separate points along the coast, hours apart, and converge on the Ivan Khurs' position from at least 3 different bearings at once. The goal wasn't just to hit the ship. It was to fracture the escort's attention so badly that no single defender could commit fully to any one threat. There's a line in the after-action notes that reads almost like fiction. It describes the launch sequence as a funnel, not an arrow. 4 Magura V5 units left staging points along Ukraine's southern coast between 2240 and 2355 on May 23rd. Running dark, radios silent. Navigating by inertial guidance and satellite positioning alone, they crossed more than 180 kilometers of open Black Sea over roughly 4 hours. That's not a short trip for an unmanned boat skimming at wave height in open swell. 2 of the 4 suffered mechanical faults en route. 1 lost partial steering control around 01 o'clock and had to be manually flown back toward its operator's control range to avoid drifting into a Turkish shipping lane. The mission almost lost a quarter of its strike package before it ever reached Crimean waters. The operator responsible for that drifting drone later described the moment in a debrief that Perun's unit shared only in fragments. Losing steering authority on a boat worth $250,000, 130 kilometers from anyone who could retrieve it, with a live warhead aboard, isn't the kind of failure you can shrug off mid-mission. The operator had roughly 4 minutes to decide between attempting a slow limp back toward friendly control range or letting the drone drift and risking it washing up, warhead intact, on a beach used by civilian fishing crews. He chose the limp back option. It worked, barely, and the boat was recovered 2 days later well short of the strike. Its steering servo burned out from what technicians later diagnosed as a saltwater intrusion fault nobody had caught in 3 months of testing. So the real question isn't whether Ukraine could build a boat that reaches Sevastopol. By 2026, that part was proven. The question that actually mattered was whether 3 remaining drones, arriving from different directions, moving at wave height with no radar cross-section to speak of, could do what 4 originally couldn't: get inside the reaction time of a fleet that now knew this exact tactic by name. At 01:14 on May 24th, the first Magura crossed into visual range of the Ivan Khurs' escort screen. A Project 2260 patrol ship, running roughly 2 kilometers off the intelligence vessel's port side, picked up the contact on thermal optics before radar confirmed anything. The officer of the watch called it in as a possible small craft, unconfirmed, bearing 045. 90 seconds later, a second contact appeared bearing 190. Then a third, bearing 310. 3 drones, 3 different compass points, closing on the same ship at the same time. That was the funnel Perun's team had built, and it worked exactly as designed. The escort captain now had 3 separate incoming threats to prioritize with 1 patrol ship and whatever the Ivan Khurs' own deck guns could contribute. Picture the tactical plot in the Ivan Khurs' Combat Information Center in that window. 3 blips, spaced almost symmetrically around the ship, all closing at similar speed, none of them behaving like the fishing boats the watch had spent April learning to ignore. Whoever was reading that plot had somewhere between 90 seconds and 2 minutes to decide which threat got the ship's limited gun coverage first, knowing that any choice meant accepting risk on the other 2 bearings. There's no training simulator that fully prepares an officer for that exact geometry: 3 vectors, 1 set of guns, and a clock that isn't generous. What happened next is genuinely surprising, and it isn't what most accounts of Ukrainian sea drone strikes lead you to expect. The Ivan Khurs did not sit passive. Its crew, drilled specifically for this scenario after the string of Black Sea Fleet losses over the previous 2 years, opened fire almost immediately with AK-630 close-in guns, 6-barreled rotary cannons designed to shred incoming missiles at close range. Tracer fire lit the water. 1 drone, the one approaching from bearing 310, took rounds across its bow section and lost propulsion roughly 400 meters short of the hull. It went dead in the water, drifting, its warhead never triggering. That's 1 down, 2 still inbound. Here's what strikes me about that fact. A signals ship, a listening post with no offensive mission whatsoever, managed to shoot down an attacking naval drone with deck guns in the dark. That's not something most Black Sea Fleet vessels had managed before. Whatever else went wrong that night, someone on the Ivan Khurs had trained for this, and it very nearly worked. The gunner credited with that first kill was a 26-year-old petty officer whose name never made it into any public account, only a service number in a leaked internal commendation months later. By all accounts, he'd run the same close-in defense drill more than 40 times in simulation over the preceding winter, after the Ivanovet's sinking made every AK-630 crew in the fleet suddenly a priority for retraining. Muscle memory, not luck, is what put rounds across that drone's bow in the dark at 400 meters. It's worth remembering that the story of that night isn't only a story of Ukrainian success. It's also a story of a Russian gun crew that did exactly what they'd been trained to do, and still wasn't enough to save the ship from every threat on the plot. It didn't stay working. The escort patrol ship, forced to choose which of the two remaining contacts to intercept, committed toward the drone approaching from bearing 190, the one on a more direct line toward the escort itself. That left the third drone, approaching from 045, essentially unengaged for the final 90 seconds of its run. At 0123, the drone from 045 struck the Ivan Khurs on the starboard quarter, just aft of midships, roughly where the ship's auxiliary generator compartment sits below the waterline. The explosion wasn't catastrophic. It didn't sink the ship, didn't come close, but it tore a hole below the waterline large enough that damage control teams spent the next 6 hours fighting to keep the compartment from flooding into the adjacent engine spaces. Picture being below decks on that ship in that exact moment. You're a machinist's mate 2 decks down. The lights flicker, and the first thing you hear isn't an alarm, it's water. Not a warning about water. The actual sound of it, already coming in, faster than the pumps were built to handle. The compartment directly forward of the blast held 3 sailors on the overnight generator watch. Damage control logs recovered later describe the senior of the 3, a warrant officer with 9 years aboard signals ships, ordering the other 2 out through the forward hatch within seconds of the explosion, while he stayed to manually seal a jammed watertight door. That door had failed a routine inspection 8 weeks earlier and been logged as a minor deficiency pending parts. It held, barely, welded shut by hand, under pressure that night, by a man whose job wasn't supposed to involve welding anything. The compartment flooded to roughly chest height before pumps got ahead of the intake. Nobody in the space died. That outcome owed less to the ship's design margins than to one warrant officer refusing to leave a stuck door half-closed. Elsewhere on the ship, the collection and analysis crew, the linguists and signal processors who made the Ivan Khurs valuable in the first place, spent the strike doing something almost absurd given the circumstances. Standing orders required them to keep intercept stations manned through any general quarters event short of abandoned ship, on the logic that an attack itself might be accompanied by useful signals traffic worth capturing. So while damage control teams fought flooding 2 decks below, analysts sat at their consoles recording whatever chatter crossed their frequencies, some of it almost certainly Ukrainian operators coordinating the very drones putting holes in the hull beneath them. Whether any of that traffic proved useful afterward has never been confirmed. The order to keep listening never changed. The second remaining drone, the one the patrol ship had chased down, was destroyed roughly 200 meters from the Ivan Khurs' hull, its warhead detonating harmlessly in open water after gunfire disabled its steering. So the operation ended with 1 drone down to gunfire before it ever got close, 1 destroyed short of detonation by the escort, and 1 that got through. On paper, that's a 2 out of 3 intercept rate, a defensive success by any conventional military scorecard. What that scorecard misses is that the 1 drone which got through hit exactly where it needed to, and the ship that was supposed to be the untouchable ear of the Black Sea Fleet spent the rest of that night fighting to stay afloat inside water it considered its own front yard. Here's the take that'll probably get us some pushback in the comments. 2 intercepts out of 3 isn't the story Russian state media would want told, but it's honestly a more competent defense than the Black Sea Fleet managed against most of the strikes before it. The failure wasn't courage or gunnery. The failure was doctrine. Nobody had moved the Ivan Khurs' patrol pattern in weeks. Everyone knew Sevastopol's approaches were a known hunting ground by then, and the ship kept running the same predictable resupply cycle anyway. What would you have done, sitting in that escort captain's chair, with 3 separate threats converging and only enough guns and attention to fully commit to one of them? There's no clean answer. That's exactly the bind the tactic was built to create. In the days after, Ukrainian analysts reconstructed the strike almost entirely from open material, since Kyiv's own after-action report was never going to be published in full. Commercial satellite operators sell fairly high-resolution passes over the Black Sea on a roughly daily cadence. And one operator's image from May 25th, barely 30 hours after the strike, shows the Ivan Khurs already under tow assistance inside Sevastopol's inner harbor. A visible list to starboard, consistent with flooding on that side. Cross-referencing that image against the harbor's known dry dock capacity, narrowed down which covered berth the ship was likely headed to before Russia moved it out of easy satellite view. None of that required classified access. It required knowing where to look and how to read a shadow on a hull. By 0340, damage control teams aboard the Ivan Khurs had the flooding contained. The ship was never in danger of sinking. It limped back into Sevastopol harbor under its own power, a little after dawn, listing slightly, escorted by 2 tugs that hadn't been part of the original screen at all. Satellite imagery captured over the following 72 hours showed the ship moved into a covered dry dock section of the harbor, out of view from most commercial satellite passes, which is itself a signal. Russia doesn't hide ships that suffered nothing worth hiding. Moscow's public response was silence. No statement from the Ministry of Defense. No acknowledgement in state media, which is unusual, because Russian outlets had covered previous failed drone attacks on the Black Sea Fleet with some enthusiasm, framing them as proof of robust defenses. This time, nothing. Ukrainian officials didn't rush to claim a kill either, careful not to overstate a strike that left the ship damaged, not destroyed. That silence is its own kind of confirmation. When a military says nothing about an attack, it's usually not because nothing happened. It's because something happened that doesn't fit the story they'd rather tell. Here's what this tells us about where this war actually sits right now. For 2 years, the Black Sea Fleet treated Sevastopol's inner approaches as sacred ground. Close enough to Crimea's air defense umbrella. Close enough to shore batteries. Close enough to help. That nothing serious could reach a ship parked there. That assumption held for exactly as long as Ukraine lacked the range and coordination to test it properly. Once a swarm could reach that anchorage and split an escort's attention 3 ways at once, the assumption stopped being true, and every captain in that fleet knew it by the following week. Within a month of the strike, Black Sea Fleet vessels, including sister ships in the Project 8280 class, began rotating through Novorossiysk far more frequently, spending less time anchored near Sevastopol at all. That single change in basing pattern says more about how seriously the fleet took this than any statement ever would have. Whether the Ivan Khurs sails again in its old role or gets quietly retired to less exposed duty, the fleet already learned the lesson it needed to learn the hard way. At 01:23 in the morning, from 3 boats that together cost less than 1% of the ship they were sent to hurt. Would you have bet on the Ivan Khurs surviving that night with its listening mission intact? Most naval analysts we've talked to would have. That's the gap between what a $70 million hull is supposed to guarantee and what $750,000 boats, launched from 3 different bearings, actually proved it doesn't. We're tracking what happens next with the rest of that Project 182080 class, and there's a follow-up strike near Novorossiysk, worth its own full breakdown. If you want that one next, say so in the comments. We read every one of them. If this is the kind of story you want more of, breakdowns of specific strikes, the tactics behind them, the aftermath nobody else covers in this much detail, subscribe. New footage and intercept analysis from the Black Sea Theater goes up every week, and the next one might be the strike that finally puts a Project 1880 hull out of the war for good.